Hi there guys. So in the last video what we did was talked about different types of oils and greases that we use in general airgun maintenance. So what I thought I'd do in this one is talk about some of the Loctites we use and some sort of general applications for them. Okay then, so first of all we'll touch on Loctites. Now these 5 here are the 5 that I generally use in the garage. However, there's only really 2 that we use in general airgun maintenance, and that is the blue Loctite, the 243, and either of these 2 sealant Loctites. This is the one I used to use, and it's the 542, but there's also another one that's very similar, and that's the 545. So the blue Loctite is a thread lock, and these 2 sealant ones here are more for sealing off air, and these should be considered secondary seals to be used in conjunction with an O-ring rather than the main sealing action. And then these 2 in the middle, this is red thread lock, which is the 262. This is very rarely used in air guns. I'll explain a little bit about the properties in a minute. And then finally, Loctite 480. This is more of a glue rather than a thread lock, but I do find myself reaching for this very rarely. Okay then, so what I'll do is I'll pick each one out one by one. I'll explain a little of the use, how they work and how to use them. Before I do that though, there are just a couple general rules when using Loctite. Number 1, don't forget to shake the bottle a little before you use it, especially if the bottle's just been sitting for a while. Rule number 2, make sure the threads are free of any grease or oil. They don't need to be laboratory clean, they do need to be free of any debris and any oil. I normally wipe them on a blue piece of cloth like this, if they've just come out of the box, or if they've been in the rifle and are a bit oily, I sometimes give them a quick squirt with isopropyl alcohol and just wipe the worst of it off. And the third thing to keep in mind is that these products do have a shelf life. Normally it's written on them, so for this red Loctite I've got until the 4th of the 22nd. You're normally pretty safe a few months after that if I'm honest. But I will say when the thread lock does get old, it does get a bit gluey. When it gets really old it fails to go off. Okay then, we'll start with the blue Loctite. Now blue Loctite is sort of a medium strength. It is removable, so if you do need to get the bolts out after you've used blue Loctite you can, and it just generally stops bolts from coming loose and undone of their own accord. A good use for blue Loctite is any bolts that seem to vibrate loose on their own. So if you watch my Daystate Red Wolf reassembly, you'll note that we used blue Loctite in the 2 retaining screws at the back of the rifle. These 2 screws do absorb a lot of the recoil energy from the hammer, so they are quite prone to coming undone. But a little dab of blue Loctite on the threads just helped to stop them coming undone. Right then, so now that we know what it does, how do we use it? It's very simple to use. All we do is we get our bolt that we need to Loctite, make sure it's clean of debris and free of any oil or grease. So once we're happy and it's free of debris and oil, we take our blue Loctite and just put a very small dab on it. So I don't know if you can see that, but a little dab on the end there, and that's plenty for this bolt. If you gob up the whole thread with lots and lots of the stuff, all it does is squidge out the top. So I've found a little drop on the very end of the thread works wonders. As you screw the bolt in, it does work its way up the thread, so the thread gets a nice little coating over it. If you have a bolt that you really don't want to come undone, but you don't want to use red Loctite, you can put a very small amount on this face here. What this does is help stick the head of the bolt to the top of the surface that you're screwing to, and it just creates another additional lock on it. However, 90% of the time that's not needed. So, we take our Loctite bolt, and then just snug it up, like so. And now the bolt's in there and it's not going to vibrate loose. Right then, so now blue's out the way, we'll move on to red. Now, I said the blue was a medium strength thread locker, so the red stuff is the high strength. The red isn't considered removable without additional heat, whereas the blue can be unscrewed if you need to. We don't use red Loctite that much in PCP airguns. It does have some limited place in spring guns, where blue Loctite just isn't enough to hold some of the bolts in. However, even in spring guns, red Loctite's quite rare, and to apply the red Loctite is exactly the same as with the blue. Just take a piece of the red, dab it on the very end of the screw, Just a dab will do you, then wind the bolt into the part you need Loctited. As with the blue, the red Loctite does start to grab after about half an hour, but it does take 24 hours to fully cure. But when it's fully cured, the bolt's almost impossible to remove without the use of additional heat. Right then, so we've covered the thread locks and we'll move on to the thread sealers. These are the two I use commonly. The 542 is just a general purpose thread sealant. If I'm honest, I like the 542 better. I just find it works a little better in our applications. So the main use I've found for these sealants is with gauges. Probably one of the most common leaks you find in air guns is it leaking from the gauge. So normally there's a O-ring or a Delrin seal on this end of the gauge, but sometimes they can leak, especially on some of the older crowns. The Delrin seats can leak, so putting a little bit of thread sealant around the gauge is a good shout. Again, like the Loctite, you don't need lots of it, but just a nice amount around the base of the threads. As I said before, these shouldn't be used as primary sealing methods. They should only really be used in conjunction with an O-ring or another sealing method. Right then, so I'll just show you how one's used. I'm going to be using the 542. The only thing with the gauges is you've got to make sure that no thread sealant goes up the middle there. You certainly don't want any thread sealant going up and causing your gauge to stick. This is just an old busted one. As you can see, the needle's gone all the way around. So I'm not that bothered about it, but that's just a thing to watch out for. So I normally put a little bit on. That's probably a bit too much if I'm honest, so I'm going to just remove a little with a cotton bud. But that should be enough to stop any small weeps. So I've just got a gauge fitting block here, and as we can see, we've got an O-ring in the bottom already, and we've got a little bit of thread sealant around the gauge. I've felt the gauge touch the O-ring. We've got some sealant around there, so there's no way that gauge is going to leak now. The last one I want to talk about is Loctite 480. Now this stuff is more of a glue than a thread sealant, but it's one I wanted to include in this little list. It's quite handy to have around. I typically use it when gluing little Delrin spacers under bolts to stop them scratching the anodizing. I'd put the glue sort of in the middle of superglue and epoxy. It's not brittle like superglue is, but I wouldn't say it's as strong as epoxy. Right then guys, let's go about do it for this one. So I hope you found that interesting or maybe useful. But for now guys, thanks for watching.